Welcome to Happily Ever After is just the beginning. Keeping your relationship not just together, but happy, and we mean truly happy, is part art and part science. You've come to the right place. Here's your host, Leslie Dories.
Sex without marriage may not be that big of a deal, but marriage without sex, that can be a different animal altogether. No, marriage is not just about sex, but regular physical intimacy is one of the benefits of having a life partner. It isn't only about physical pleasure, but about the deeper connection you can have with someone you know and who knows you really well. Now, if the two of you are satisfied with the amount of physical affection and intimacy in your relationship, great. But if you're one of the many couples who struggle with this, then you are in the right place. So Alicia Jenney, licensed marriage family therapist and owner of Modern Love Counseling, is here to impart valuable information on how to understand what's happening in your marriage and how to move through it. So Alicia, thank you for coming on the show and talking about this really important topic when we're talking about marriage and long-term relationships.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You wrote a post titled, and I love this, Sexless Relationships and the Layered Cake Metaphor, as a means of answering the question, why aren't we having sex? So tell me a little bit about this metaphor and what the first layer of the layer cake might be.
Sure. Yeah, so I have to give credit to this amazing therapist that I just recently hired in my practice, and her name is Kate Breslin, and she and I were consulting over this because it's incredibly common for us therapists to, work with this type of, quote unquote issue or complaint. And she said, this is a way that I kind of like to communicate it with clients because metaphors are obviously really helpful for us to look at from a, objective perspective. And so, she kind of was helping me understand that, romantic relationship is often like a layered cake, right? And each layered cake builds off of each other. And like without one of the layers, the cake feels kind of incomplete, kind of like a relationship. So, the foundation is friendship, and a lot of times, this could be just like we have mutual commonalities, we have fun, we have kindness, we have respect, some fondness and appreciation of each other. And the second layer is like emotional connectivity. So that's, a little bit more intimate than friendship, right? So maybe that entails more emotional vulnerability, reliability, compassion, validation, things like that. And then the third layer is like non-sexual physical touch. And so this one I think is really paramount because a lot of times I hear in my, my couples work that traditionally speaking and generally speaking, the women will say, I never really quote unquote want sex, or I never really initiate physical intimacy, or when my partner even, initiates like a hug or a kiss, like I kind of like shut it down. And oftentimes that's because I think women are intimidated and feel pressure that like the second their partner comes in for a hug or a kiss, that they immediately assume that it's about sex. And, sometimes when there is a lack of sex in a relationship, sometimes there is some urgency and there is some excitement, on the male counterpart's, position. So I think that this one's really interesting and really helpful because when you're focusing on, elevating the comfortability of physical intimacy, like love taps and, like flirtation and kisses and hugs and cuddling, and that not lead to sex, then that almost leads and breeds, I think, some comfortability with just, I can have physical affection without the pressure of having to have sex. Right? So, and then the other piece is, the top layer, which is sex, sexual intimacy. And that could include, foreplay, erotic play, any types of sex play. And so, when I think couples nurture the layer that comes easiest to them, right? And those are the same couples that I think focus too heavily on the lack of sex that they're having. And, I think that if you can't, obviously the foundation, right? If you can't have a respectful and engaging friendship that allows you to feel more emotionally safe and have non-sexual connection, it can be really challenging for you to be motivated or for you to have like as good of sex as you're hoping to have. So that's sort of the layer cake metaphor.
Well, and it's so interesting that you talk about friendship because, when we think about falling in love, when we think about, being attracted to somebody, and I know you know this because you're a licensed marriage and family therapist as well, but, we know that period of a relationship is driven a lot by hormones and biology. And, we could be physically and sexually attracted to somebody who's actually not a really good match for us. But when we're caught up, but when somebody's caught up in the throes of that in love, haze, that they might not necessarily, be looking at the more important factors. So what would help people, if maybe they don't start out as friends, but maybe they start out with just this hot and heavy, physical attraction. How do they become friends? Because you're right that we have to feel, we can't be in bed all the time. That might be great, but most of the time somebody has to go to work and we need to eat and all those fun things.
Sure.
We can't spend our life there, and so how do people develop a friendship?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good question. And, it's like, how do you develop a friendship, or how do you sustain it, or how do you deepen it? And I think those are like all of the journeys of a long-term committed relationship, and it just comes at different times and different points. But, I think that when we're talking about, this layered cake metaphor, I think it's about just, understanding like what layer are we focusing a lot of our attention to, or which layer comes most comfortable to us, and how do we go outside of our comfort zone. So if friendship is the foundation, but it's something that the relationship's lacking because they either never had it or they're just, maybe they fell off track a little bit, I think it's about like, finding that commonality, like what are some of the things that you guys value, or what are some of the things that, you both can bond and relate to, whether that's a past experience or that's like an activity or a hobby, whether that's like something, advocacy or something that you guys are both just really passionate about. But I think just like finding that and just prioritizing the exploration of finding that is important.
Well, and I also like that second layer that you talk about the emotional connectedness, that it builds on that friendship and it goes deeper. And I think that's what we're all looking for, but that's the scary part. Because you mentioned the V word, vulnerability, which a lot of people think of when they hear that word, they think weakness. And my personal viewpoint, and luckily it aligns with what Brené Brown talks about, that to be vulnerable, you actually have to be very strong. You have to feel, but you also need that container of safety and security that it sounds like the foundation of friendship really allows that deeper connection to happen. Am I remotely correct in saying that?
Yeah, I think so. Because, I think that, I often, tell my clients that, if they're in a long-term committed relationship and they're struggling with their sexual relationship, right? Oftentimes we assume that if we have the friendship and we have the emotional connectivity and we cuddle a lot, that like the sex is just given and like we should just, have a great sex life. But it's like there's so many layers to vulnerability in a relationship, right? There's like that emotional reliability and exposure. There's the financial, there's obviously the sexual, there's the physical, like if I get sick or something happens, there's, if you choose to have children together, there's a whole other component of that. So it's like, it takes I think time, and it takes patience, and it takes a lot of experiences to fully trust your partner in all of those areas, because you're building trust in yourself too, So I think the emotional connectivity absolutely does evolve as, you're building off of the friendship, because the compatibility and the commonality can only get you so far, right? That's why we have friends, because they stay in that zone. But if I then am, emotionally like opening up my weaknesses, or my perceived weaknesses, or my, my feelings or my fears or my secrets, right? Like that's a big deal.
Yes, and that's the scary part. But it's interesting because you talk about it, and I mean, the thing about being married or being in a long-term relationship, unless you're Katharine Hepburn, who would say, she wanted her men friends to live close and visit often, but most of us actually live with our partners 24, I want to say 24/7, because we're not, other than COVID, we're not usually together for 24 hours a day, but we are, I mean, they see us, at our most vulnerable moments. I mean, whether we're, when we're sleeping, we're completely vulnerable. When, like you said before, when we're sick, and this whole idea of, we can get on each other's last nerves too, because it's like, okay, just leave me alone, right? But what we can hide and be more in control of with our friends, because we're not, they're not with us all the time. They're not going to just, walk into a room in our house and we don't know they're there, right? I mean, this is, it is a very different level, which I think is one of the things that makes it great, but also one of the things that can be a little bit scary, maybe, kind of. Yeah, I mean, I think most of the couples I work with are my peers, or they're millennials, right? And they're like between the ages of like 28 to like 35 or whatever. And, a lot of them, I think because either they've dated or they've maybe been divorced, or, it's like they don't know how to sometimes expose some of those vulnerabilities, right? Because they've maybe been kept private for so long, or they've learned to just deal with it themselves, or, so it's interesting because I think a lot of couples struggle with bridging the gap of eroticism and intimacy, and when that honeymoon phase is over, or when we're not desiring each other the same way that we were, we don't know how to be vulnerable in the bedroom. We don't know how to maybe talk about like the misunderstandings or our desires or our, our anxieties or whatever. And so then, we fixate on the fact we're not having sex, but not fixating on the vulnerability, right? So, yeah, I mean, and that's what I talk about, because having sex is sort of a we did or we didn't. There's usually not some misunderstanding about, well, did we actually have sex? I tell people, it can be quantified, right? And sometimes people get stuck on the number instead of what else is happening. And that's why I think I think this metaphor really speaks to the complexity of it. So this is Happily Ever After is just the beginning on webtalkradio.net. I'm Leslie Dories, and I'm talking with fellow relationship therapist Alicia Jenny about understanding what's behind the lack of sex in your relationship and how to change it. Now, sexless marriages can be very painful, and if you have found yourself in one, you may be feeling hurt, rejection, and loneliness. You may also be feeling somewhat hopeless, but there is a way out, and if you would like help finding it, I invite you to get in touch with me today. You can reach me by email at Leslie, Lesli, at foundationscoachingnc.com. That's FOUNDATIONS, coaching, N as in Nancy, C as in Charlie.com. Or you can reach me by phone at area code 919-924-0463. Again, that's 919-924-0463. And now I want to get back to this conversation about how to, be connected with your partner. And so I want to go back because you said in the beginning, and you were going through the layers, you talked about the third layer about non-sexual physical intimacy.